Yeah, it's recording now.
Okay.
Oh, man.
So before we get started, what subject, what do we want to try to accomplish today? What do you think?
Yeah, you said you had an agenda. It was something that you wanted to talk about. So it was kind of open to me. I don't have a specific agenda of topics. Yeah. So what do you want to talk about?
I think that I want to talk about the discovery process, because that's applicable to relationships with clients and with spouses.
Okay.
So I think we could probably do that if you're comfortable
Yeah,
doing
let's do
that.
that.
We can talk about
So discovery
as in just what the word implies, discovering what it is that's important to somebody.
what is the discovery process? What are we discovering?
What's important to the other person, whatever that is. It could be a wife, it could be a client, it could be an employee. And the idea is to meet people where they are, meet people with what's important to them. You can talk about your trip to Paris, but maybe the person really wants to talk about their trip to Florida.
So it's a discovery process to learn what's important to that person.
Right.
And it's applicable to marriage, obviously, to business, obviously,
right.
But really to anything as well.
To anything. And I think that there are a lot of aspects to it, but it all boils down to being a good listener and knowing how to ask questions and actually having a heart, having a concern, having a desire to know what's important to the other person. And you can't be a good financial advisor or a good husband if you never listen to the person's needs, wants, concerns, fears. Unfortunately, people don't usually volunteer them. Even wives, and especially clients, they don't volunteer. So when you want to turn on the
It's a radio.
oh, it's oh, okay. I didn't know we were actually starting. Okay. So I've formalized the discovery process as far as it goes with potential clients, because you need to be focused on what they're saying, listening to their body language, listening to their words. And if you're thinking about what you're saying, then you can't do that. So I'll talk a little bit about that process and the importance of it as we go forward. But basically, whomever you're talking to, the discovery process is a result of being able to ask questions, and even more importantly, being able to listen to what the person's saying. And not just the words they're saying, but the emotional content of their situation. I'm going to speak really briefly about that issue. There's a lot of good books on this. Reflective listening. Reflective listening is a really good skill that you need to use when a person is talking to you about a situation in which they have some emotional concerns and there's a degree of uncomfortableness about the situation. So conflict, but it could just be a situation where there's really not a conflict. They just are unhappy with a result, or they don't understand. And there's a lot of really good books on reflective listening, and I'd suggest to people that they study that. It's like there's a lot of good books on body language. I suggest you, one, read them, so we can briefly speak to that. But reflective listening is all about reflecting back the emotional context of what the person is saying to you. And if they've said something that has a negative consequence, then you want to deal with that. It could be that they have said something negative about you. It could be they said something negative about a situation, and your response is the only right response when somebody tells you that you screwed up, you're wrong, you didn't perform appropriately, you didn't keep your word, is to acknowledge that what they just said. And the easiest way to do that is say, well, thank you for sharing that. If it's a client, even if it's your wife, you say, yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I really appreciate the courage it took for you to tell me that. Or if it's a wife, I really appreciate the fact that you love me enough to tell me how you feel.
So instead of defending yourself, you acknowledge their concern.
Exactly. You don't have to acknowledge that you're right or wrong. That's not what you say.
Right.
You say, I appreciate you have the courage to tell me that. I appreciate that you love me enough to tell me that. So you're acknowledging that they've told you, and you've heard them. And so then what you say, so what I understand you're saying, or can I repeat that back, or if I understand this correctly, whatever is appropriate for your personality, and you repeat back the issue. If it's been an emotional context, you might repeat it back from an intellectual perspective. But you repeat it back and the client says, yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about, then we'll go to the next step. If they say, no, that's not what I meant, that's really a good thing, because if you addressed what you thought it was, you would have been off in left field. I remember my wife and I had a discussion for 3 days one time about a situation, and what the problem was that we each had a different understanding of the word that we were using to describe the situation.
And words can be loaded, that's true. Yeah.
And she interpreted the word one way, I interpreted the word another way. When we finally got down and defined the word, we didn't have any disagreement. There was no disagreement because we were really talking about the same aspect. We just had different understandings of what the word that we were using meant. So it's very important to repeat back. That's why it's called reflective. You reflect back to the person. Reflect back what their concern is. Maybe as a financial advisor, I think they're upset with the returns. And they're not upset with the returns. They're upset that they weren't called about the returns. And
reflection is basically you reflecting your understanding of what they're saying to make sure that your understanding is exactly what they're trying to convey.
Exactly. Correct. Just what you just did there, you reflected back what I said to make sure that there is no misunderstanding. So reflecting back is important until they say, yes, that's exactly what I mean. And then now, after you've acknowledged that the issue, then you can apologize. You can say, oh, I am really sorry you feel that way, if it's not something that you're really at fault at. Or you can say, I'm really sorry that I did that. I'm really sorry that I was that insensitive, or I'm really sorry that blah, blah, blah. Sometimes after you say, I apologize, then what you really want to do is, if you've only got one meeting, is say, can I ask you a question? And people always say yes, and that's part of discovery. Can I ask you a question? And then you can go into asking them questions about how and why they got to that place. And the questions are, well, how did you arrive at this? Why are we here? What is it that you would like to see happen? It's all about them. Why are you here? How did this happen? How did you get to feel this way? What would you like to see happen? And you can ask a bunch of questions. When do you want us to fix it? And if you ask the questions with them in mind, it even diffuses it further. What I suggest to a lot of people for the reflective listening part is you don't, especially if you're dealing with an employee, or if you're a pastor dealing with a congregant, and they have a complaint. They come in and after you've asked the questions, then you say something like, I would like to think about what you've told me and evaluate it, and would you be comfortable if I took some time to think about this and get back to you in a few days, a few hours, a few weeks, whatever's appropriate to the situation? Would you be okay if I got back to you on this?
So don't say that?
No, do say that.
Oh, do say that?
Yes, because what happens is now the client, the wife, the employee thinks you've taken it seriously enough to think about it. And this is especially important with wives and clients and employees. Why is it important? Because if you're a pretty good, they're probably wrong. But you can't tell them they're wrong, not when they tell you. If you wait a period and have thought about it, and then you sit down with your wife, and I know this, or your employee, I know this from personal experiences, or your client, at a later time. Clients might be more difficult because you don't have as good an access to them. You can now give them the reasons why the event happened, and why their interpretation is wrong, and why they need to look at it differently, and why they should have handled the situation in a better way, because they're open to listening, because you have spent time listening to them and evaluating the situation. And you come back at a later time. This assumes that you're correct and they're wrong, which I think will be at least 50% of the time, 50-50.
It's a good probability. Yeah.
So, but yeah, or the spouse.
Yeah.
And if you come back at a later time, what happens is the person is now listening. They're not defensive. You weren't defensive. You never went into defensive mode. You listened. You asked a bunch of questions. You got the facts. And it might be that what happens is you were right, but you handled it poorly. That's what happens a lot of times. As you get more and more mature, you realize you were right. I was right. But I handled it poorly with my grandchildren, with my children, with my wife, with my client.
So the conclusion may have been right, but then the way you went about doing it may have been wrong.
May have been wrong, right. They got upset not because I was wrong, but because I didn't handle it as well as I could have, or I misrepresented it. Whatever.
Yeah,
whatever the circumstance might be.
Yeah.
So a lot of times the issues aren't about right and wrong. They're about the way a person felt about the handling of the situation. It's and I would say that 80% of the time, 90% of the time, the issues are that when people are upset with me, is my handling of the situation, my interaction with them, and not the actual facts of the issue. So reflective listening is a very, very good methodology to employ when somebody is saying something about you or about a circumstance or about an event that you've been involved in it is uncomfortable for you because they feel that you were not handling it appropriately.
So by taking time off, you're even though you know the conclusion, like for example, if you're right, even though you know that conclusion, by taking time off, you're actually also, in fact, giving yourself time to maybe cool down if you yourself are angry, right?
Exactly.
So you can cool down, you can form your thoughts on a more appropriate way to respond as well.
Correct. You can influence them or negotiate with them or persuade them. Yes, you're able to have a much more effective communication with them.
And they felt that you didn't dismiss them because
You didn't. You listened to everything, and you never said. All you said was, "Would you be comfortable with us getting back together to discuss this
and you
at a later time?"
defensive, and so they cool down as well.
Right. You're not defensive, and you notice I never said that I was wrong. I just said I'm sorry that you felt that way. I'm sorry that you had to experience this discomfort. I'm sorry that this wasn't handled in a way that you really would have liked better. And you ask a bunch of questions. What would you like to do? What would be a good solution? What? And you don't make a big deal about it. You just ask the questions, and then you. And if it's a wife, can we talk about it after dinner? You know, let me go upstairs, change my clothes, and we can talk about it. Would you be okay with that? Remember, always end your relationship conversations with a question. That always puts the other person in control. You know, say, okay, we'll talk about it after dinner. You say, we'll talk about it after dinner. Are you comfortable with that? Is that okay? By always ending with a question, you allow the other person to feel like they're in control, which is not a bad thing. I must say, I hear my wife say, "How does that sound?" 50 times a day. She'll say, "We're going to have dinner at 6. How does that sound?" You know, "We're going to go out with the Joneses tonight. How does that sound?" You know, "Why don't you wear the red tie? How does that sound?" You know, it's like she never says to me, but rarely, "Wear the red tie. Be home at 6 for dinner." You know, whatever. She rarely ever makes a declaration that she doesn't follow up with, "Are you okay with that? How does that sound?" I use the word comfortable a lot because I found that to be a very effective word. So you never want to, in communication, you never want to end with a declaration if you can, because it doesn't put the other person in control. Now, there are some cases with some people that they want you to be in control, and so that's a different story. But generally with clients or others, it's nice to let them say yes or no. Then you get a buy-in. It's awfully, you never know if you don't say, "How does that sound?" You don't know if you get a buy-in. Say to you, "We'll go to lunch after this," and I keep talking. It's like, I can't go to lunch. I got to meet a guy. So I say, "How does that sound?" Then it gives you a chance to respond. I can't. I'm meeting somebody. So and it keeps the relationship from the other person's perspective comfortable. And that's
applicable for. So coming back to the conversation we had earlier, basically, where you acknowledge their concerns, you apologize, or you say you're very sorry about how they feel. You get the facts, you ask questions, you get the facts, and then you say, you know, "Can I come back and talk to you in 10 minutes,
that's a good
whatever."
That's a good summary.
Yeah.
All right. When somebody, the first thing you want to do is thank them for having the courage or taking the time to tell you. So you got to thank them first. So thanks for doing that.
Thank them first. Apologize. Get the facts.
Thank them first, because that's really, really important that you acknowledge that you're not mad because they told you something. You know, I really appreciate it for a wife. You love me enough. I really appreciate to a client. I really appreciate it that our relationship's important enough that you'd feel comfortable sharing that with me. And then before you apologize, you've got to ask them, let me understand if, let me repeat back to you what I think you said. You've got to repeat back to them because you might be apologizing for the wrong thing.
Right.
So the first thing you do is thank them, and then you say, let me repeat back if I can what I think I heard you say, or anything like that where you can, because sometimes people are really mad and they're yelling and screaming and they're not really speaking logically, and so you have to take the emotional context. So it appears that you're really upset about. Yes, that's exactly what I'm upset about. But maybe it's not. I'm not upset. No, I'm not upset that you gave the so-and-so the raise. I'm upset that you didn't tell me first. Oh, so you're not upset he got a raise. No, he deserved a raise, but you should have told me that he was getting a raise because I'm his boss. Oh, you're right. That could be the case. Here's an example. So you got to make sure that you understand what the person's upset about, and then you can do the third step, which is apologize in a way that makes them feel like you really are concerned. And then after that, and they acknowledge that, then don't try to ask questions too soon. Then say, is it all right if I ask you a couple questions? You got to ask them if you're going to ask them questions, and they'll say yes. And then you ask questions. Well, what would you suggest that I do next time? Or how could I handle this better? Why were you concerned that this was an issue that you needed to be involved with? Could you help me with that? And whatever, just the who, what, when, where, why, and how questions. You just ask them until they've exhausted themselves and they don't have anything more to say. And once that happens, then you may be things may be calm enough for you to right then and there go into, would you be comfortable with me telling you why I went down that path? Things they might say, sure, yeah. If you have a really mature relationship with somebody, you can do it right there. Because they wouldn't have gotten that upset to begin with anyway, but you can then deal with it right there. But a lot of times a delay is good. I got to run to the bathroom. Let's go get a cup of coffee. You just take a little break and then you come back and we can talk some more about this. And just a little break so that when you come back now, their mind's open to listening to your side of the story.
Cool.
Okay.
So that's a situation where someone's upset or they're feeling very uncomfortable. What other situations are there for discovery purposes, basically? Okay, so
I think that discovery, that's a form of discovery because you're discovering what it is that's the situation. But in the discovery process, the first step, there's 6 steps in a good discovery in a good 6-step sales process, I'll call it. As I told you in one of the other videos, you always want to be selling. If you really love someone or you like someone, you always want to be figuring out what's in their heart so you can help them justify it in their head, especially your children. You want to always be seeing what's in their heart so you can help them justify it in their head. You want to do it with employees. What do they really want to accomplish? What are they really looking for in their heart? You can help them justify it. The heart. What did Dennis Peacock say? The head justifies what the heart desires, and that's what we want to do, and help people justify. So that's our job, is help people justify what their heart desires. And as a financial advisor, that's pretty much what I try to do. I help get a mental, intellectual decision that justifies what's in their heart. And with my wife, and with my kids and grandkids. So, you always want to have people be comfortable in your presence, where you're attractive to them. If people are uncomfortable in your presence, they're not going to want to be around you, and they won't like you. So people want to be liked. So how do you make people like? You make them comfortable in your presence. And how do you make them comfortable in your presence? You ask them a question that relates to the positioning that they have at a position for a certain point in time. So the 6-step process starts with positioning. Every conversation starts with positioning. How many times have you left home, everything was fine, got a kiss goodbye, you're going for 3 or 4, 6 hours, 8 hours, you come back and your wife is upset. Now, it can't be upset at you because you might think she is when you walk in the door, but you weren't there for 8 hours. You didn't call me. You were supposed to call me, or the kids are such and so, or whatever. The car broke down. So it's always good when you walk back into a relationship to ask the question, to figure out what the position is of the person you're talking to. For an example, well, good relationships do this all the time. When we met this morning, we was talking, hey, how was your trip? How was my trip? What you been doing? We touch base on where each other is at. If I got a cold, But positioning, you want to make it a conscious effort, especially with a client, where you ask them specifically. So since our last meeting, have you had any thoughts about what we talked about? How are you thinking about that subject? What's your feelings on our last conversation? Have you had a chance to talk to your wife, talk to your banker, talk to your CPA? Have you had a chance to think about? And you want to know what the client's position is, so you can position the conversation appropriately for what needs to be accomplished. And the same thing when you walk in the door at night. How'd your day go? My wife asks me that all the time. Positioning. How'd your day go? Who'd you talk to today? What happened?
So positioning is trying to figure out.
It's a discovery. No, you're discovering.
Discovering.
The positioning, the emotional, physical, mental positioning of the person that you're with. Where are they?
Relative to where they were previously, or where you think they were previously.
Right, or where you think they ought to be. Or you want to discover where they're at.
So maybe they were thinking one direction, but then since the last meeting, they might have thought another direction.
Right. With your wife, it could be since this morning. This morning we're going to go out to dinner. You come home, we're not going out to dinner. Right. And you say, hey, I'm ready. I'll be ready to go in 10 minutes. We're not going out. It's like now she's upset because you assumed that we're going out to dinner, or maybe you assume we're not going out to dinner and she assumes you are. And it's like, well, when I left, we weren't going out to dinner. Yeah, but we have to go out to dinner because blah, blah, blah. I got a call from your friend and he's coming into town and we got to go out to dinner. So by positioning, by asking a question, and a discovery is all about asking questions. By asking a question about where the person's at relative to everything, or questions, then you're able to have a conversation where the other person's comfortable. They've got it off their chest. They're able to express their concerns. And people say to me, well, how come, especially husbands say this to me, well, how come they always get their way? How come I have to do this? How come I have to ask the question, and I have to do the positioning? And my answer is that if you're the boss of the company, you're the leader of the house, you're the professional that the person's coming to for advice, then you're the one that has to do the positioning, questioning.